For almost 20 years, an entire village knew a secret and not a single word got out. It was July 1929 in a village cemetery in the Hungarian countryside when a group of men began to open graves. And the strangest detail of this scene wasn't even the graves, it was the audience. Because the whole village dropped everything they were doing and went and packed into the cemetery. The local newspapers recorded this. That's right, everyone wanted to see what would come out of the ground. And they stayed there in absolute silence, broken only by the sound of shovels hitting the dry earth. They stood there watching the dead come back. What those men were looking for beneath that ground and what they actually found is the craziest part of this story. I'm Marcos Campos, and today's case happened almost a century ago in a tiny village in the middle of the Hungarian plain, and it raises a lot of questions, okay? How did serial deaths go on for almost 20 years in a place where everyone knew everyone without any of the local authorities asking a single question? Why were the first people who tried to report what was happening prosecuted? And why did the excavation that could reveal the real scale of this thing suddenly stop like that? Right when the whole world started looking over there? That's what we're going to investigate together, so get ready and let's get to the facts. The letters. In April 1929, 3 letters arrived at the Royal Prosecutor's Office in Szolnok, the city that served as the administrative capital for a rural region nestled in a bend of the Tisza River in the heart of Hungary. 3 letters anonymous, and each one accused a woman from a village called Nodarev, one of poisoning her husband, another of poisoning her husband and son, and a third of poisoning her son. Now, if you think that this, immediately set off alarms with the authorities, it didn't, you know? The prosecutor's office sent the rural police to investigate, and the police quickly found out who had written the letters. And it was a woman from the region itself. But since she couldn't back up what she was claiming with evidence, do you know who ended up facing charges? That's right, the accuser, for making a false accusation. And the real accused stayed at home, and the case ended right there. Looks like it wasn't just the case that died, you know? And what happened wasn't an isolated incident. The historians of this case who went through the archives found warnings piling up for years already. Anonymous letters that no one looked into deeply, suspicious deaths that no one wanted to dig into. In 1924, a local doctor was so suspicious of a patient's sudden death that he formally requested the exhumation of the body. But the request was denied due to lack of evidence. In June 1924, a resident published in a local newspaper that the whole region was gossiping about mass poisoning. The result of that? It was a defamation lawsuit. The unusual pattern, let's say, was that those who killed weren't held accountable, but those who reported it were. But the letters kept coming. At the prosecutor's office in a rural police station, anonymous notes kept appearing talking about deaths, some with the names of victims, and the name of the murderer. And in June 1929, in a neighboring village near Nodarev, one of these letters finally turned up a lead worth following. The letter accused a couple of having poisoned the husband's father years earlier. The police finally followed this lead and found a resident who had heard the story from the mouth of Nora, the wife of the deceased. And when the couple was arrested, something no one expected happened. They both confessed on the spot. Next, the second couple was arrested, denied it, and ended up confessing later as well. And all 4 detainees pointed to the same thing, the source of the poison. But where this source would lead to, I'll tell you in a moment. What matters to know now is that at the end of June 1929, everyone was taken to Szolnok. And the ice, let's say, after almost 20 years of complaints that no one really paid attention to, had finally been broken. But if the ice broke, what appeared underneath it wasn't just a crime or two in isolation. It was actually a structure that involved the entire village. Remember when I asked how this lasted so long? The answer started with the numbers. From there, the rural police moved to Nodrev, that village, set up a base inside the village, and started calling women to testify, 17 just in the first round. The confessions that had started gradually began to increase. Between July and October of that year, in almost 3 months of non-stop investigation in the two villages, in Nodrev and also in the neighboring village of Tisakirti, the authorities filed 77 murder charges there at the Sonic prosecutor's office. 77, guys. Just so you have an idea of what that number means, Nodrev had around 1,000 inhabitants or so at the time. It's worth noting that there are other versions of how this case came to light, okay? A statement from a medical student from a nearby city who supposedly found extremely high levels of arsenic in a body that had been found in a river. And another story that was researched and recorded by the historian Bela Bodo, author of the first academic book about this case, talks about an anonymous letter sent to the editorial office of a small newspaper. The versions get mixed up, but they all lead to the same point. In 1929, the silence of that region then screamed. And then came the decision that turned a local investigation into a worldwide case: to open the cemetery. This is really a massive action, a measure that Hungary had simply never applied before. On July 22, 1929, the first graves there in Nodrev were opened, with an investigating judge, experts, and even a defense lawyer closely following everything. And this is exactly where that scene from the beginning of the episode fits into the timeline. The shovels, the graves breaking the silence, hitting the dry ground, and the whole village gathered around wanting to see what was going to happen. The samples were sent for analysis in the capital, and the result that came back from the lab days later needed no interpretation. It was arsenic indeed. And in large amounts, okay? According to the police report from that time, the exhumed bodies contained, on average, enough arsenic to kill 8 or 10 adults on average. And the numbers that became popular around the world talk about an initial batch of 50 exhumed bodies with arsenic found in 46 of them. 46 out of the 50 exhumed bodies contained arsenic. That definitely wasn't a random crime, was it? It was clear there was a pattern. And to understand how a village that size got to this point, we need to go back almost 20 years in time to a world that was about to catch fire. The village. Nodrev was, and still is, a small dot on the Hungarian plains, southeast of Budapest, right next to the Tisza River. In the 1910s, as I said, about 1,000 people lived there. Everyone farmed, everyone knew each other, and no outsider had any reason to want to be there. It was really like a small settlement, a kind of village, very simple. You know that kind of place where the road actually ends? You have to get there through the fields and all that? That's it. It was so isolated that the village didn't even have a doctor, just so you know. The closest one, according to the most recent reconstruction of the case, lived about 8 kilometers away, and he couldn't always make it there. So sometimes the person who acted as a doctor in this village was a midwife, a woman born in the village itself who had been delivering babies in Nodrev since 1893. And with the turn of the century, she also became the village healer who treated illnesses and took care of the dead. For all intents and purposes, she was the doctor the village didn't have. And she was more than that. In a community where women had no one to rely on, let's say. The midwife was the person you went to with any problem, if you know what I mean. Even the ones you wouldn't tell anyone else. Now, for this story to really make sense, you need to understand what it was like to be a woman in that place. And back then, marriage wasn't a choice, okay? Far from it. The family chose the girl's husband. Usually she was a teenager. And she accepted it because there was no other option. Divorce did exist on paper, but for a poor peasant woman tied to her family, land, and the family's reputation, getting a divorce was almost never a real option. The woman entered that marriage kind of knowing that only death could take someone out of it. Then came 1914. And the First World War swallowed that world. The Austro-Hungarian Empire called millions of men to the front, and the husbands from the village in Nodrev went along too. But the war affected that village in another way no one had predicted. Because it was such a remote and in many ways peaceful place, Nodrev became a detention point for prisoners of war. Enemy soldiers captured on the battlefield and sent there. These men walked around the village with some freedom even, And they even worked in the fields that the conscripted men had left behind to go fight for their country. They became, these prisoners, part of the local scenery, then part of the routine, and later part of some households. That's right. Because they started romances with the women who stayed there, the prisoners and the married women whose husbands had gone to war. For 4 years, those women lived a life that no Hungarian peasant woman from that region had ever lived, handling everything on their own and for the first time choosing who they kept company with. But then the war ended, and the husbands came back. However, the men who returned to that village were not the same ones who had left. Many came back mutilated, sick, needing constant care, the exact opposite of the providers they had been. Post-traumatic stress didn't even exist as a diagnosis, of course, at that time. What existed was a broken man at home, suffering the consequences of war, and many of them came back determined to restore the old order, as if those 4 years had never happened. Historians describe the outcome with a very precise expression, an explosive situation, and it's at this point that history takes a turn, we could say, because the answer to the pain, the conflicts, the explosive situation had kind of existed for a while, and it was there at the midwife's house, the medicine. The women from the village of Noderevi already took everything to the midwife, right? Childbirth, illness, heartbreak, the internal conflicts there, relationship issues. So when life with the husbands who came back from the war became unbearable, it was to her that many women brought that as well. And the answer that came out of that house, according to what was found out later, was that if the problem is him, there is a simple solution. Researchers recorded that the midwife even had a customary phrase, a question she would ask anyone who came complaining about life. Why are you putting up with him? The solution was arsenic. And this is where homemade chemistry comes in, because she didn't buy the poison ready-made. She made it herself. And the method was actually frighteningly simple. Flypaper, something anyone could buy at a corner store back then. It was boiled in the same pot where the soup was made. As the water heated up, the arsenic would be released, forming a kind of thin film on the surface. It was death being prepared on a household stove. After that, all you had to do was collect this film, then concentrate it and bottle it in small vials. Some reports say that the price of this varied depending on the client's budget, okay? And later, during the trials, there were even accounts of the midwife charging for her services. And the instructions for use when people went there for help were a simple phrase: mix it into his food or drink. And according to the records, many times, little by little, okay? Dose by dose. Arsenic is a damn convenient poison. It has no color, no smell, and blends into anything. In soup, in coffee, in liquor, even in dough for dumplings. The symptoms, vomiting, stomach pain, diarrhea, were practically identical to the symptoms of cholera and infections, which were already frequently killing people in the countryside. A poisoned man died in a way that to anyone watching that situation looked like any other death, a tragedy. But good poison wasn't enough. What made Noderev's case last so long was what came after the death. Check this out. In a village without a doctor, the one who actually said what someone died of was, in practice, the midwife herself, because of all the context I've already explained. And the official who examined the dead and officially certified the deaths was her cousin. In other words, the death business was all set up, wasn't it? The death seemed natural, the cause was given by her, and the paperwork went through her family. No one from outside saw anything, because on paper there was really nothing to see. Here is definitely the main link in this criminal chain. And she guaranteed one thing to her clients, okay? That poison wouldn't leave any trace in the body. But here's the irony that turns this whole story around. The turning point, right? The discovery. Arsenic can fool a doctor when examining a patient, but it doesn't disappear. It stays in the body, in the bones, even years after death and burial, right? Decades after the burial, neither the clients nor the midwife knew about this. And you must remember that scene at the cemetery, right? All those excavations, do you know how much this ignorance about how long arsenic lasts in the body would cost? Well, it would cost us some of the most remarkable cases in criminal history. Look, the first confirmed arsenic death there in Nodorev was in 1911. The victim was a sick man, and that's 3 years before the war started. So the method didn't start with the war because of all that stuff, right? The husbands came back, the women were fed up, they were already seeing the prisoners who were around there. What the war did was scale this up. When the husbands came back from the front, men who had been healthy until then started to get sick, to die, and officially no one found it strange because, as we saw, each death was reported as cholera, as an infection, as a common illness. Inside the village, however, the researchers described something else, that this was a custom the whole community actually knew about. The accused women themselves summed this up for the press, okay? When the case broke out. A phrase that hardly needs any comment. It was an old custom there. They did it before us and they'll do it after us. And the fact that it didn't stop with the husbands might actually prove that. And this is where things really get ugly. Over time, women started knocking on that midwife's door to solve other kinds of problems. Elderly parents who had become a burden or whose inheritance was taking too long. Lovers, and as the trials later showed, even children, very sick babies, little kids. Poisoning became, and this word is actually in the Hungarian sources themselves, a trend. A homegrown solution that was passed on from kitchen to kitchen. How many victims did this scheme claim? Well, hold on to that question because it's the end of this story. What can be said now is that for almost 2 decades, the killing system did not fail. No serious investigation, despite the suspicions, was carried out. No convictions. Those who tried to warn were prosecuted, as we saw, until the letters from 1929 came, and this time, finally, the police found that little thread to pull, right? The one that unravels the whole story. The net closes in. Well, pulling on that thread, we can remember the end of June 1929 when those 2 couples were investigated, arrested, and confessed, right? They identified the source of the problem, the poison. So then, the trail led the police to 2 women. I'll introduce you to the first one in a bit when I talk about the trial, okay? And the second one was obviously the midwife from Nodorev. The police arrested the woman, interrogated her, and a few days later, released her due to lack of evidence. There are even records that after she was released, she was put under surveillance. The police wanted to see who would come knocking at her door. Then, around mid-July, the police moved into the village. As I've already told you, right? They set up there, established a base, and so on. And then the confessions came in an avalanche. It was really like a herd effect. On July 18th, one of the accused women, check this out guys, was also a midwife. She ended up hanging herself. And the next morning, July 19th, 1929, the police marched again to the house of the main midwife, let's say there in Nuria de Nodorev, this time to finally arrest the woman. But she knew what was coming. According to the police report from that time, she had been watching the street for days, and she had something prepared, caustic soda. When the police officers showed up at the corner, she noticed. She drank that mixture. A resident who was a child at the time said decades later in a documentary that all the kids ran after the police officers and that when everyone arrived, she was already dead. She was lying next to the well where she had left the poison ready. The village's death record was suicide by poisoning with caustic soda. The central figure in this case left the scene without answering a single question in court, and her name was Jujana Fozakashi. She was 68 years old. And she was born right there in Nodorev in 1861, and she had been delivering babies in the village since 1893. In other words, a good part of that village had literally passed through her hands at birth, and at death too, right? The neighbors called her Aunt Juj. And her record already had a pattern before the arsenic, okay? According to the records, she performed illegal abortions, was taken to court several times for it, and was acquitted of all charges. Long before the poison, Aunt Juj had already seen the justice system in that region come close to her and leave empty-handed. Repeatedly. I would even say that probably this must have encouraged her to keep running her schemes, right? And she wasn't the only one to choose that way out, okay? In total, 4 women under investigation took their own lives. One of them, according to the press at the time, hanged herself in her cell before the trial began. With the main suspect dead then, and the whole village under investigation, the Hungarian justice system was left with a question of a magnitude it had never faced before. Who exactly was going to pay and for how many deaths? The court? The answer to all of this began to take shape in Szolnok and took 2 years. There were 12 main trials between December 1929 and November 1931 in the dock, 28 people, 26 women, and 2 men. The first trial was set for December 13, 1929, with 4 women being tried together. And notice a detail in the official strategy. According to the records, the authorities deliberately split the case into separate trials precisely to try to avoid publicity. But it didn't work. Not at all, I'd say. Hungarian national newspapers put the case on the front page. On the other side of the ocean, the New York Times reported that this was the biggest poisoning case of the century. And Nodarev was given the nickname by the press it would carry from then on, the Village of Death. Suddenly, the whole world was looking at a courthouse in the Hungarian countryside, waiting to see the faces behind it all. And that's when the first shock came, let's say. One of the greatest Hungarian writers of the time, Zsigmond Moritz, was there in the courtroom. His report describes the packed courtroom and about 20 journalists, photographers, and illustrators following everything. What he called the eyes of the world were there in that courtroom. And what he recorded about the defendants might be the most disturbing part of this whole case. No sinister figures, okay? The first defendant he described seemed, in his words, like a sweet little grandma. An elderly lady in black clothes, well dressed, standing before the judges with her hands together, as if she were in church. The accusation against her was that she had killed her own mother 9 years earlier, then her husband, and then her lover, all with the boiled poison from flypaper. And Moritz, that journalist, wrote that, before the court, she looked like an aged child, naive, like a frightened granddaughter who had been caught in mischief. And in the testimonies, the language said it all, okay? The defendants didn't talk about poison, they talked about medicine. That's how the records and research describe the way many of them saw arsenic, as a medicine against the hardships of life. The thing you use to make problems go away. Another defendant, the second one mentioned in Moritz's report, who entered the room proudly with her head held high, testified in court that the midwife was always after her with the same question, why suffer with him? And in the records, which the BBC recovered decades later, one of the women stated that she didn't feel any guilt at all. Her husband was a very bad man who beat her and tortured her, and since he died, she had found peace. The motives, as they emerged case after case, covered the entire spectrum. Violent husbands, husbands who came back from the war disabled and became dependent on the women, inheritance and land, wartime lovers, sick relatives who had become a burden. And there's also a case that show how this web spread across the villages, okay? The same one, by the way, that blew up the case back in June 1929, because the neighboring village had its own midwife in this scheme. She was the one who resold the arsenic solution, which, according to the investigations, came from the house of the main midwife, Fosi Fozikash, or as she became known there in the village of Nodirev, Aunt Jugi, who by that time, as we saw, was already dead. In the records that reached the Superior Court, this second midwife, from another village, is described as having killed her husband's brother with poisoned tea in an inheritance dispute. In 1925, providing the poison and the idea for a young man to kill his own father, a man who drank and threatened to squander everything the family had. The young man's wife is said to have helped, and this young man is one of the only men who sat in the defendant's seat in this entire case. For a moment, it seemed like the trial of the century was heading toward a wall of convictions. But there's always a but, isn't there? The confessions, the foundation of everything, started to be withdrawn one by one. And without confessions, what was left? The forensic analysis proved there was arsenic in the bodies, but arsenic in a body doesn't point to the hand that served the dish, probably where that arsenic was. In several cases, not even the most careful chemical analysis reached a conclusive result. The outcome then of this morbid, macabre math was far more cases were opened than sentences were handed down, and the vast majority of cases ended without any punishment due to lack of evidence. Of the convictions that stood, 6 death sentences were handed down, 3 women were actually hanged, and one of them was the midwife from the neighboring village, the so-called reseller. The other death sentences were overturned on appeal. One defendant was acquitted on appeal, and the others had their sentences commuted to life imprisonment by the country's Supreme Court. In addition to the death sentences, there were 8 life sentences and other prison terms ranging from 5 to 15 years. Even so, a lot went unpunished. That was all the justice system managed to account for in a region where just the first round of exhumations had found 46 poisoned bodies. And the ruling identified the mastermind behind all of this, the deceased midwife Jujana Fozakashi. She was officially established as the central figure in the whole scheme, and on that, the sources don't disagree, okay? It was her who came up with the method, it was her who provided the poison, but the exact extent of her role in all of this, no one can measure anymore. And historians point out why. The main accused died before giving a single statement in court. She couldn't defend herself, she couldn't contradict anyone. And for each living defendant sitting on that bench, the more blame that could be put on the dead woman, the better it was. The press did its part. The newspapers of the time called the accused murderous beasts, monsters, and turned the dead midwife into the official monster of the story. But later research records 2 things that kind of mess up that picture. Other women also took part in distributing the poison. And there are murders that have no connection at all with the main midwife. The newspapers even gave it a name, Chapada. They called the defendants the Legion of Jagermari, in reference to a poisoner midwife from a famous case decades earlier in another Hungarian city. Which made me go back to that phrase from the women, right? Who said they did it before us and will do it after us. Precisely because what that court was judging in all that uproar deep down maybe wasn't the work of one woman or those women there in that context. It was tradition. And that's exactly what takes us back for the last time to the cemetery. Those men with shovels and the whole village gathered around watching. Now you know what they were looking for, right? And you also know what they found. What's missing is the part that's almost never told, the final reckoning. The police records from that time add up to 162 exhumations. And that's just in Nodorev, okay? And in the neighboring village. And here the numbers start to conflict with each other. There are reliable sources that treat this same 162 as the total number of murders attributed in the cases. The historian, however, Bela Bodo, author of the first academic book, as I said, right, about all this, says he considers between 45 and 50 deaths to be proven. And the estimates for the entire region reach up to 300. A number that was never confirmed. Almost 100 years later, not even the numbers in this case agree with each other. And do you know why they'll never agree? Because the search stopped. When the case blew up, it made national headlines and then an international scandal. The excavations didn't continue in the other villages in the region, and the graves that could answer the final question remain closed to this day. In 1937, a Hungarian sociologist who traveled through that countryside had already given the region the name by which it would be marked, the Arsenic Zone. And before we wrap up, let me tell you how this case became known, okay? In Hungary. They became known in criminology as the poison mixers of Tiszazug, which is the name of that region. But in the rest of the world, the case became known by another name, and it's even more macabre than it sounds, okay? The Angel Makers of Nodorev. Angel Maker, guys, is an old euphemism in Europe. There are terms in Hungarian and German for a woman who performed illegal abortions or let unwanted babies die. The logic is that old idea that when a child dies, they become a little angel. They go straight to heaven. So, in the end, those who caused these deaths were making angels. And in this case, for some reason, this headline, this title for the case developed over time. The Angel Makers. Also because the Hungarian texts call Fozakash herself, right? The main midwife there. Exactly that. The Angel Maker midwife. That's because she performed abortions, remember? But when the case blew up, the nickname took on a broader meaning. Those women had started making angels out of grown people, husband, father, relative, literally sending the problem to heaven or hell, depending on the person, right? In the end, only 2 records remained of what all that meant. And I'll finish with them. First, in the 1950s, a historian imprisoned by the communist regime met in jail a man from that region and heard from him that around there, women had been killing their men since time immemorial. The second, in 2004, a resident of Nodirev, who was a child at the time of the trials, gave an interview to the BBC about what changed in the village after everything came to light. And her summary was this: after the poisonings, the husband's behavior toward their wives improved considerably. That's right, my dear abductees. I want to know your opinion about all of this, especially in that context. Do you see these so-called angel makers as a kind of victim too, given the whole context there? Or just as cold and calculating killers? Leave your comment here for me. I really appreciate your company. Don't forget to check your subscription. There are episodes like this every week. A kiss from the redhead and see you next time.